this is Rachel, and this is the first video in our series for beginning gardeners, walking through the process by which we created a backyard vegetable garden from scratch in a suburban subdivision without going out and buying a bunch of materials, because this is the spring of 2020 and we are in the middle of the COVID-19 outbreak and we're under quarantine. So we were really working with what we had on hand, and I suspect many of you might be in the same situation. So this is meant to be a helpful tutorial for those trying to build a garden from scratch. And today's topic, the first one, is site selection. We're doing this first, not just because it's sequentially what you have to do first, but it's also really important. Where you put your garden and all of the factors affecting it, everything from light, water, different factors like wind, can really impact how much work you're going to have to do later. And working in a way that sets you up for success is really, really helpful. So my goal is to flag the things that you need to think through such that you can be in a position where you're not doing a lot of extra work. And so the first thing that we looked at was social context. This neighborhood does not have a ton of gardens. I should say not a ton of food gardens. There are a lot of very lovely decorative gardens, but nobody really seemed to be growing food. And when we walked around on our daily get out of the house during quarantine family walks, we looked and almost no one had any kind of food garden at their house. We found one in the entire subdivision that seemed to have a raised bed. Now, we did go through the HOA bylaws, and they are not forbidden. There's nothing that says you can't have a food garden, but it was pretty obviously not the norm. And so putting the garden in the front yard really didn't feel like the right way to go. Now, our lot has the house most of the way towards the south end, and normally in the northern hemisphere, you would like to put your garden on the south side of the house because it'll get a lot more sunlight. In our case, that just felt like we were going to be inviting a lot of odd scrutiny from the neighbors. And personally, I love the idea of edible landscaping. I think we should be doing more of it as a society. But we're only going to be here for a year, and it just didn't feel like a good move, especially when we thought about resale, etc. Given this isn't our forever home, we didn't want to do something that was going to make it hard for us to sell or move later. So we also looked at the fact that there are a lot of dogs in the neighborhood, including ours, and on daily walks and peas, we were not wanting to end up with salad greens and dog urine. It just felt like a bad combination. So for all of those reasons, we pretty much ruled out the front yard and decided to start looking at the backyard only. And so the rest of the analysis I'm going to do in this video is really only looking at our backyard. The other thing you want to think about is sight lines from the house and proximity. So keeping it relatively close to the house is really, really valuable. It means that if there's an issue with insects or animals eating things, or there's a particular weed that's getting out of control, or a plant is starting to wither and die, you'll catch it early, and the earlier you can catch things, the better. You can give it amendments if that's what it needs. You can, pick off insects. You can do things to protect the plants, and they can come back, versus if it goes too long, sometimes you're starting over completely, or you're just working a lot harder to fix the problem. So a good sight line from the house is important. Now, as I mentioned, our backyard is to the north, and therefore the sun blocks a lot of the light. So unfortunately, we can't put the garden right next to the house, but we can put it still within a good line of sight. Our main living areas, the kitchen, the dining, and the living room, look to the backyard, and so we do have a good line of sight from the house, even if they aren't right next to it. So to show this context in a simple visual way, I've put together a sector diagram, and this is a permaculture tool. I'm just a permaculture nerd, so I like to work this way. You don't have to, but I thought for the purposes of this video, it would help show how I think about this and break it down. And the first step is just to go to your county GIS website and get a map of your property. You can just Google your county name and GIS, or sometimes your county name and plot map, and you'll find what you need. And the other nice thing about that is you can see where your property boundaries are. That's a pretty important question. It can seem obvious, but sometimes it's not. In our case, that whole big berm to the north, in some ways would have been a nice place to put a garden because it's got this south slope and gets good light. That's not on our property. And so knowing that was pretty important. If we had put the garden in there, somebody could have easily come through and insisted that we remove it right when we were about to start harvesting everything. So understanding where your property lines really are is pretty important. Easy to overlook, but please don't overlook it. Now in our case, you'll see I've drawn a sector here for roads. we have busy roads to the west and to the north, and that means for us a lot of noise during the day. You'll probably hear it in these videos all the time. But also with a road, you can have exhaust coming off the cars, you can have dirt flying up from the wheels. When it rains, things like gasoline and oil that are on the surface of the road can run off onto your property. And in the winter, if they salt the roads, which in Michigan they very much do, that salt will also leach off onto your property. And so normally I would say you want to avoid putting your garden right next to a busy road if you can. Now in our case, those roads are on top of that 10-foot berm, and it is covered with trees and bushes and has quite a bit of bark and stuff below those trees and bushes. Nice kind of carbon sponge that helps mitigate some of those impacts. So in our case, it's not that big of a deal. Now the next thing you'll see here are sectors for the summer sun and the winter sun. And this is drawn for where the sun rises in the morning in the east and sets in the west. And if you're interested, I can give you a link on how you would discover these. It's just a good way of visualizing for yourself when you are likely to have sun and shadow. You can also just go out and look at this during the day, so it's not required that you draw this as a sector. But I wanted to show that for our property in the summer, essentially we've got good exposure. So the house will block the sun in the winter to a great degree, but I'm not planning a winter garden here and I'm not as concerned about that. And after that, I felt pretty good that even though we were looking at the backyard, we would have a decent amount of sun exposure. The last sector here is wind. And in our case, the winds come from the southwest. I can give you a link here to where you can see windroses for your property and figure out from which directions your winds are going to come. In our case, the house blocks those winds to a large extent, which is really, really helpful. Wind, especially in a storm, can take down a trellis, it can knock things over, it can tear up plants, debris can fly across, but generally if you have a sustained wind, it will also just dry things out. And so it can be really, really nice not to have heavy winds, and so having a bit of a buffer there with the house in our case is actually really helpful. The next thing we wanted to look at was topography, and the reason topography matters on your site is that it will dictate the flow of water, and the flow of water is really, really important. So you can see here a contour map that I created for the site, and I'll give a link to this too, so that you can go. It's a free tool. I find it pretty easy. You zoom in on the map to your particular lot, and then you click the two corners of a square to tell it where you want this drawn, and you tell it how far apart you want the contours to be. In this case, I did 1 foot contours, and it'll generate a contour map. Now, there's really, again, no substitute for just going and looking at your property and observing it in person. But I found that starting with a contour map, at least for me, helps me to go and figure out where I really need to pay attention. And when I looked at the contour map here, not surprisingly, it shows this berm to the west and to the north. But it also told me that this is a low point not just on our lot, but for the neighbors as well. There's a storm drain to the northeast, and I'll try and mark that here with a red circle so you can see it in a minute. But that collects water from our lot and the neighboring lots. So water is being intentionally concentrated down this berm and into our backyard. And the thing about that is it's not just water. So water is already a problem. We have clay soil here, it doesn't drain well, and a lot of water in one place means flooding and drowning roots. It also is an area of a frost pocket. So cold air follows the same movement as water. You can think of it flowing in exactly the same way. So if you have a low point on your property, it's going to collect that cold air. And in a cold climate in particular, that is potentially a big challenge. So you can have on a day when the average temperature might be 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you can have a frost situation in these areas and your plants are essentially subjected to freezing temperatures on a day when it's not otherwise freezing. So you want to avoid that. So when we looked at that combination of topography and then site observation, we just went out and looked. And after a couple of rains, as suspected, there was a ton of standing water, a lot of wetness. Frankly, the whole backyard is pretty wet because of these two berms, but in particular, the northeast corner was really bad. Then there was a night when it got down to 30 degrees, and so we just made a point of getting up the next morning and looking at that area and seeing whether or not, in fact, we had frost pockets, and we did. So in the morning, the backyard northwest corner and kind of the north edge of the berm, the frost disappeared very, very quickly. To the northeast, it lingered there for, I want to say, well until 11 or 12. So we ruled out the northeast corner for that reason, which left us with essentially the northwest corner. We couldn't go too far north because the berm's off our property, and so now we were looking at the northwest corner. And at that point, we moved on to sun exposure. And so, as I mentioned with the sectors, when we looked at the broader exposure of the sun during the summer, we should have plenty. But again, it's just good to go out and verify. So I went out in the morning, midday, afternoon, and evening, and just took pictures of what the site looked like in the northwest corner at each of those times. And good news, we had sun during all of those times. Very importantly, we had sun in the morning. And when you're in a colder climate like ours, that morning sun is pretty key. It comes in, it warms up the soil, it wakes up the plants, it melts off the frost. So if I have to choose between morning sun and evening sun, I will almost always go for the morning sun. In the evening is the hottest time of the day, and especially in the summer, it can actually be a little beneficial to get some evening sun. So we really were happy to see that we had good morning sun if we put it in the northwest corner. The other good sort of discovery here is that western berm, although it's covered in trees, there's a nice chunk of them sort of right in the middle of the berm that are deciduous trees. And so the evergreens block the sun completely, but right now the deciduous trees haven't leafed out. And so as you can see in the picture that we took in the late afternoon and early evening, the sun came through very nicely. And so we were still getting this filtered evening light, even with a treed berm, which means that we'll get good sun now when we need it. And then as they leaf out in the summer and the sun moves higher in the sky, we will start to get much more shade on the garden, which could in fact be helpful when we're thinking about summer heat, which is really helpful for us. So happy news all around. So at this point, we were very much leaning towards the northwest corner. It is a little more wet than we would like, but we can pull all of that, I think, together with some raised beds to improve drainage, and we'll do a video on how we built those and how we put soil in such a way as to improve the drainage. We feel like we've got a good line of sight from the house. It's private from the neighbors. No dogs are going to get in there to pee on things, and we're not going to be putting our plants in a frost pocket. So for all of those reasons, we were very happy with finding this location. The northwest corner of the lot seems to work just fine. And we have about 10 feet by 20 feet to work with. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about how we chose what to grow. And then I'll take those plant choices plus the 10-foot by 20-foot area and the need for raised beds, and I'll put together a garden layout. And I'll talk through how I chose what to put where in order to maximize the microclimates and the success rate of the garden. So I'm hoping that that'll be really helpful for you guys. And then after that, I'm going to move into how we actually planted the garden out, so you can see our spring planting, and then later we will do the summer planting. And eventually, as we move through the series, I'll also work on things like harvesting and pruning and those kinds of things. But for the next couple of videos will be very much focused on choosing plants and figuring out where to put them. So I hope that was helpful. If there are any topics that I didn't cover, please comment down below and let me know, and I will try and address them as we go through the next series of videos. And if you'd like to be notified when we post them, subscribe and you will be notified as we put them up. Our goal is to document this pretty much in real time as we go through it so that you get the information in a timely manner. So we'll probably be posting 1 or 2 of these a week, of full-length videos, and then when we have little snippets we think might be useful, we will put those up as well on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to follow us on those channels as well, you'll get both the short snippets and the full-length stuff. So again, hope it's helpful. Let me know, and good luck. Get growing. Have fun out there. Thanks.